Hey, I'm Ossie from Three Monkey Solderless, home of the world's best cables for your pedal board. For audio, for DC, whichever one you need, we got them. Check us out at threemonkeysolderless.com. All right, so for today, I thought it might be interesting to, let's say, put the Panama chase slightly on hold, but not really, and go into, I think, a more kind of interesting analogy for tone, for sound, for sonic fingerprints. So I figured we would discuss a little bit of that. We had some comments on the channel last week about, like the human voice, and that just kind of rang a lot of bells in my head. Not hard to do, regarding what makes something sound like something, right? Now, we all know, like, a human voice is very recognizable. If you were to listen to, excuse me, listen to a videotape, well, you can. If you're listening to an audio tape of somebody's voice that you can immediately pick that out. Now, you can also people can mimic voices, things like that as well. But generally speaking, right away when you're listening to somebody that right? There's a certain unexplainable quality to it as to why it's recognizable. So I figured that would be a good place to sort of look at things and explain sort of why, like, the voice is like as unique as a fingerprint, and why a guitar tone might also be as unique as a fingerprint. Not to saying that it can't be, because fingerprints can be duplicated, can't really be duplicated easily. Supposedly there may be one other person on the planet with a fingerprint that may be similar to yours. Okay. I think getting a guitar amp to sound similar to another person's guitar amp is a hell of a lot easier than trying to make a voice sound like another voice or a fingerprint match. All right, so let's just go through this explanation, sort of analogy of what creates the recognizability of a tone. So let's go into GarageBand again and listen to some Eddie tracks and look at the frequency analyzer. So let's go into that right now. Okay, so we're in GarageBand right now, and what we're looking at is the same sort of project from last week. We have the Panama track, but I've added this track. It says it's a duplicate. Never mind the name, but this has actually got the Running with the Devil isolated, as I just wanted to find a chord that, was sustained over a period of time. So Running with the Devil, the beginning of it has a very, let's say it's a great what would be transfer of the fingerprint of Eddie's guitar sound. So let's bring up the EQ again, which has the frequency analyzer. Okay, now before we look at this thing, let me just explain something, because we're going to come back out of this and look at it. Right here on the vertical, right, on this axis, we have what would be considered decibels, right? Sort of like signal strength, let's call it, right? Signal strength. So this would be how loud something is, right? So as I go through and get louder and louder, the peaks rise, right? And if I go away, they get lower, right? So this would be considered sort of the, let's just call it loudness for very simplistic reasons. And then on this axis right here, the longitudinal axis, right? This axis here, we have the frequency. Now you can see over here we have the little area which denotes the frequency just below my little pointer here, my mouse cursor. And you can see as I move the mouse cursor across, you can see the frequency is going higher. So we're going from low frequency to high frequency. All right, so that's just like a basic primer of what we're looking at. Guys that have looked at this stuff for a long time obviously know all that stuff. It's very simple, similar to any graph you've ever seen in like basic math. So it should be recognizable for everybody. So now let's go ahead and listen to the track, and I'm going to take a screenshot of the track, and then we're going to quickly look at it. All right, so let's play the track here, and I'll just take a screenshot of it. Okay, so we have our screenshot down here, and now we can just, let's see, Okay, so right here is what we were just looking at. Now you can see we have a bunch of peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. And obviously, you know, as waves get higher frequency, they get squished together, right? And that's what creates the sound variance, right? It's sort of like aligned with the Doppler effect that, you know, frequencies that are closer together are higher pitched than frequencies that are further apart. So keep this sort of like graph in mind again with the peaks and the valleys and the two axes of information. So let's get out of this screenshot and we'll go into the live room and we'll look at it on paper a bit, and I'm going to give you a quick analogy for the whole thing. So let's stop this here. All right, so we're back in the room. I've got out the dreaded piece of white paper in the Sharpie. So we're going to do a little bit of third grade drawings here. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to just draw a basic sort of graph, right? With our two axes. Okay. Let me just move this little cursor bar out of the way so I can see better if it's coming through. That looks good. All right. So on this side over here, we're going to have, let's say 0 through 10. All right. So you can see. And on this side, we're going to have 0 through, let's say 20. Okay. So this will represent the frequency. So this is the freak. And this is, let's say, loudness. So it's very easy to understand, right? We're not going to go through dBs. We're not going to go through gain. We're not going to go through any weird terms. We're just going to use loudness and frequency. All right. So we noticed what Ed's guitar looked like. So I'm going to try to draw like an approximation of that. It's not going to be accurate, obviously, but for these purposes, it'll work. All right. All right, let's just say that that's it. It looks like, I don't know what, but it doesn't look like his sound. But let's just go through it and figure out what we're looking at here. So we can assign a number to each one of these peaks and valleys. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say, let's do this as 5. Then this would be 6, 7, 8, 9, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so on this side, we've assigned 0 through 10 and the frequency over here. So let's start assigning numbers. So this one over here looks like about a 5, right? This one over here looks like about a, let's say, let's just call it a 3, right? The next one, let's say it's a 5, and it doesn't have to be perfect, right? The next one we're going to say is a 2. This one over here, let's say, is again a 5, and this will be a 2, and then a 5 and a 2. I should have made this a little bit more variable. Let's say that's a 1, that's a 6, that's a 1, that's a 4, and that's a 3. Okay? So this can be looked at as almost like a code. All right? So we have what we want to look at here, let's say, are the differentials between the peaks and the valleys. All right, so let's say we subtract each one of them and assign it a sort of a code. So we got a 2 would be here, a 3, another 3, another 3, a 4, a 5, and a 1. So in a sense, the differentials between peaks and valleys would be a 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 6, 5, 1. And that would be the same thing as when they're looking at a fingerprint. I probably shouldn't put this too close to the camera so you guys don't try to finger me for some crimes. But anyway, they would assign ridge differentials between the ridges to figure out, how to code a fingerprint into a numerical system. So we're trying to code, very broadly the sonic sound of Ed between these numbers. Now, if you were to take, let's say, a filter, like a very simple EQ filter, like bass, treble, whatever it is, a high cut, a low cut, okay? What you're going to find is that, and we'll do this what you're going to find in there is that it still sounds like Eddie's guitar, right? You can take, like, let's say a high cut, right? And you can take it and you can start to cut off some of the highs, right? But you still have differentials of gaps between these sounds. So it still ends up sounding like Eddie's guitar, even if you roll off the treble or increase the bass, or if you dip the mids, right? The sonic fingerprint doesn't really change. And that's because the relationship, that code, doesn't really change either. It is moved up or down linearly. So each one of these numbers, in a sense, will go down by the same amount, in a sense. So let's go back into GarageBand and take a look at the effect of, like, just doing like a different kind of a cut to this sound that we have, right? The running with the devil sound. So let's go back into GarageBand for a second. Okay, so we're back in GarageBand, and again, you see we have the graph here. So, you can see how these spaces between these peaks and valleys, that is what creates the sound of Eddie's guitar and what makes it recognizable. Now, if we were able to blow this up, this image right here, in a sense, I don't mean like with Photoshop, blow it up, but rather get a more in-depth analysis, right? Where you're talking about looking at every point in this graph itself. You would see these kinds of peaks and valleys everywhere. I mean, it becomes what we would call fractal, right? Where each one of these tiny portions of the music, of the frequency, have harmonics of their own, right? And have different waveforms of their own. So if you were to take sort of the space between, let's say, 100 and 150 over here, you would find along this curve right here, this part of the curve, tons of this as well. If you were to sort of blow it up, like you're using an electron microscope of tone, you would find that this is not exactly as straight as it seems. There's all kinds of little variations in here. So you end up with an infinite amount of variation inside of itself that creates this sound. And that's why, let's say something like when we're using the aux box, or we're using, something, well, that's where fractal audio got their name from, right? It's the nature of the universe being fractal. Or you're using any one of the, sort of like modeling amplifiers. There just simply isn't enough processing power to be able to model this kind of a phenomenon accurately. It can be quite close, but it's never quite going to be perfect, because at some point it has to say, I've run out of room. I can't really resolve any more of these, fractal images of small portions of the waveform into more harmonics. It can't do it. There just isn't enough. You have to make a compromise. So you figure, what is the resolution of the particular file or particular impulse response we're going to make? The more in-depth the resolution, the more likely it is to sound realistic. But the more resolute it is, the more resolution it has, the more processing power it's going to take. And being that it's actually in the analog world really infinite, because every single time that you go into even a fractal portion of this waveform, there'll be more. It never ends. So I've always said there really isn't enough processing power in the world to model correctly a burp. It just doesn't exist. It's just not possible. So anyway, that's kind of getting off into way left field, but let's talk about, let's go back to doing what we're doing. So I'm going to get out of our waveform or go back into the track, bring up the live sort of EQ, and you can see my voice right here. It has all of that in there as well. Let's go ahead and we'll get a quick filter. Let's do like a, let's do this. Let's use a mid-band kind of right here. Let's use this one right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull it down, right? So you see that basically it doesn't really change the, sort of the relationships too much between the peaks and valleys. It just sort of linearly depresses them all by a fixed amount. So my voice still sounds the same. Right here, you could still tell it's me. All right, even when we're pulled down here. And when we go way up here, it still sounds like me. But why? Because those relationships are basically still the same between the peaks and the valleys. So when you're trying to like dial in a person's guitar tone, something along these lines, like an EQ, is a very blunt tool. Now, it helps you get in the ballpark of what the studio was doing to the sound. But if the fundamental relationship isn't there, all of this work here is for naught. It's basically chasing your tail. Now, if you get into things, let's say like exciters, right? You can do things, or parametrics, you can get a little more surgical, and you can get in there and you can maybe notch something out a little bit more, and you can make things sound a little bit different. So let's open up, we're on the master, right? So let's bring in a exciter. All right. And I'm going to bring the exciter way up so that it really makes a huge difference. Okay. Now you can still see that, you know, you can still hear the fundamentals of my voice is still the same, even though we've excited a very small section of the bandwidth at 1.1K. up 200%, that, you know, it's still recognizable. So even this may be a little bit more, let's say, surgical. It's still not really where you want to be. So you hear my voice here versus here, right? It emphasizes certain parts of what the character of my voice are, but it fundamentally doesn't change it, right? It still sounds like me. All right, so I think that's useful. Because I don't know. I mean, people that have had a lot of experience with this may be very rudimentary, fundamental information. But for someone that's getting into it, that spends, you know, would spend too much time trying to EQ a track to make it sound like another guitar, it's kind of a futile effort. The image has to exist first, right? So let's pull up the analyzer once more again. EQ. And let's listen to this track. I'm going to back it up just a little bit. You know what? Actually, we can loop. Can we loop it? No, let's not do that. Let's just listen to it. And that'll be good. All right, so through that, you could sort of see what I'm getting at, right? That it just emphasizes linearly the fingerprint that's already there. So it's kind of like if you were to take a picture. I've gone, you know, I like that analogy still of a photograph. The differential between the intensity of the pixels is what creates the image, right? And if you use brightness and contrast, you can emphasize a certain portion of the image to make it appear like there's more light on it, or you can dark it out. But that image of what it is, let's say you took a photograph of a fork. If you move the contrast around, it's still going to look like a fork, right? You're not getting away from that fact. You would need to, you know, fundamentally alter the image, which is not really possible to do in photography with a simple brightness contrast. You would have to go into, using artificial intelligence or something like that, something goofy like that. So that's what we're dealing with here, is that you have to have this relationship set. Okay. Now, if you were to look at let's say later on in life with Ed, which is interesting. Let's say like the Panama stuff. Let me get there. You're going to notice that this is the same amplifier, I think. So let's listen to it again. So we got the Panama. Okay. Now let's go to this track again. The Running with the Devil. Back to the Panama track. All right, so to me, those waveforms and what's the underlying image between the 1984 sound and the Van Halen 1 sound is extremely similar. It's extremely similar. I think what we're dealing with in the differentials between getting the two sounds is the treatment of the EQ. And possibly, some simple phase angle changes that have a result of, combining signals that are slightly out of phase, which would be a result of, miking a room where there's the waveforms flying all over the place, bouncing into each other and canceling out, where the mics are placed in relative to the cabinet, and what signals are combined together into producing the final guitar sound, right? Because there's probably more than one track that we're listening to on any particular cut, right? You're going to have the reverb. You're going to have maybe the room mic. You're going to have maybe two mics on the cabinet, and all those things, how they're blended together will create those phase angle differentials, which will accentuate or, let's say, sort of de-emphasize particular frequencies. But I think in general, we're dealing with the same amplifier. All right, so let's get back into reality here and finish this up. We're back in the room. I hope some of this is making sense. And if it's not, it's my fault. Because I'm really trying to explain this stuff off the top of my head. I kind of woke up this morning thinking about, this whole issue of whether, I'm sort of trying to impress is whether I'm capable of relating it properly, whether I'm capable of explaining it in a way that's, that's coherent. Because sometimes I think my mind skips around a little bit and does some things and most famously assumes facts not yet in evidence. So I don't know if I'm thinking, hey, they already know what I'm thinking. So therefore, when I don't tell them this part, they know what I'm talking about. And that doesn't always work out, right? So I'm trying to express this across. So when we're doing this Panama chase, which we're going to continue with, right? When we're going to do some pedal work with like the harmonizers and all that stuff, that's accoutrement, right? That's sort of like, it's like, the final photoshopping of the picture of the fork. It's not the fork. It's not the photo. It's not the negative. The negative, that's a good word. So what we're trying to do is find a way to create the negative and turn it into the different Van Halen sounds. Now, I feel personally, now this is me, just me. So, we all hear things a little different. And I think that a lot of times, you tend to, and I've seen this with guitar players all the time, that they tend to, after a while, focus in on one particular area of their sound, whether it be a positive or negative, something they're looking to get rid of or something that they're trying to get. And everything else becomes sort of like background noise or is outside of the focal point and is out in the periphery and isn't even noticeable. I can relate to a story which is really interesting. So the first time I brought, it was the Brad Whitford 119 amplifier, what would become that. And this is back maybe like 2002 or something like that. And he, you know, I had been building some things prior to that for studio work and for some live work, but I wanted to get his opinion on this amplifier that was making that. I thought it'd be cool for him. And so I went down to Philadelphia, and I had the thing on a piece of plywood, right? Just the chassis bolted to plywood, and was holding it like, you know, it's a little suitcase, and brought it over to him. And he was playing at the time, and he had a setup, and they were doing sound check, and I was on the side of the stage, and I put the amplifier on top of everything. We plugged it in, and he started playing through his gear, and I was like, wow, that sounds really good, you know. And it was Freddie Tacone's divided by 13s, and I was like, that sounds amazing. And he came over, and he was like, so let's plug your stuff in. And I looked at him, I said, are you sure you want to change that sound? Because it's really good. And he was like, all right, let's just listen to it. So, you know, we put the amp up, and he played it, and he liked it. And he was like, I think we're going to put it into the rig. And I was like, that's cool. And I was thinking to myself, you know what? I told him, I said, I think maybe you're just got a little bit of ear fatigue, right? That you've been hearing this sound for a while now, and maybe you're looking for just a change, and that's it. So I was suggested at the time, maybe just rotate back and forth between like 2 or 3 amps. And I think you'll always find that you'll have a fresh ear, and the thing that you've been focusing on that you're not happy with, or that you want to get into it, is going to change, and you're going to feel a little bit better about that. So yeah, that's just a side sort of like story that it happens to everybody. So when we're looking for something, you know, we tend to exclude other things. Now, I don't even remember what I was talking about. Now, for me, I think, you know, we all hear things differently. We're all focusing on one thing, right? That's where we came at it. So for someone else, it might be like, I'm not hearing the very top end. They're like, okay. Or I'm not hearing this little particular nuance of the amplifier, or I want to hear this particular nuance of the amplifier. But for me, the way that my ears have been set up, or the way I've been chasing things, I'm really happy with the way my amp sounds right now. And I'm pretty much at this point, I don't change it. And I haven't changed it since, you know, the very first videos. I just think it's about right. Or as close as I'm ever going to get, where I just don't see where it's, for myself, I don't see what it's missing. Other people may, I don't. So what my challenge is now is to use that amplifier and now make it fit into the various eras of the sound, right? So 1984, we're going to do that. We'll do, you know, we will do a Fair Warning. We'll do, you know, Women and Children. The only one I don't know about necessarily for certain is but we'll have to look at it. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, is Diver Down. I don't know what that was yet. It may be still. I have to listen to that a little bit more. I haven't listened to that album in a long time. So yeah, so that's where we're at. We're going to now try to make this fit into the sonic sort of profile of the room and the accentuated points of 1984. So stick around, and we'll try to make even less sense in the near future. So anyway, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.